These are the supplies that will be helpful in cutting up a carcass. Much of this equipment is designed to protect you from injury. A metal or Kevlar glove should be used to protect your hand during the butchering process. Chainmail gloves are made of links of fine wire, while the white gloves shown here are made with a special fiber called Kevlar. It is essential that all gloves be properly washed before use. The metal glove can be washed in a dishwasher, and Kevlar can be laundered in the washer. You will wear the glove on the opposite hand from the one you use to wield the knife, so if you are right-handed, the glove is worn on the left hand to protect it from stray cuts of the knife. Heikke is wearing a cotton glove on the hand wielding the knife. Check your local butcher supply for gloves. During processing, it is useful to have a variety of knives. The first knife, shown here, is good for skinning. The second knife, also with a black handle, is for cutting. It is important that the blade is long and flexible. The third knife, shown in our picture with an orange handle, has a dull point with a sharp inside edge. This is used for both skinning and gutting. It is essential that all knives be kept sharp. A good sharpening stone will help keep the knife sharp and give a good clean edge. Keep the cutting environment clean. Wear clean and protective clothing. Heikke has on a Tyvek disposable coat, which is available at a butcher supply. An apron will protect clothing from bloodstains and may provide some protection against accidental knife wounds. You may find a meat saw is helpful. Remove cheesecloth from the carcass. If possible, hang the meat prior to processing. It is easier to process and keep the meat clean when it is hanging. This also allows the cutter to get at prime cuts such as the tenderloin. Care should be taken to keep meat clean. Cheesecloth protects the meat from contamination. A clean carcass eliminates the chance of contaminating meat by introducing dirt and bacteria from the surface into muscle tissue when making a cut. If meat has dirt or contamination on the surface, you should trim it off before further processing. Immediately after death, the muscles go through rigor mortis. During rigor mortis, glycogen in the muscle is converted to lactic acid, which causes a decline in pH. pH is the measure of the acidity of the meat. The rate of this decline greatly influences meat quality. You can influence the rate of pH decline with temperature. Ideally, keep the carcass at 55 to 60 degrees for the first 24 hours. This temperature allows the carcass to reach the optimum pH within that first 24 hours. After 24 hours, the carcass should be held at 45 to 50 degrees until processed. If possible, wait at least 24 hours before beginning the cutting process. The more acidic the meat, the longer the storage life. A lower pH environment inhibits bacterial growth. A pH of 5.6 or lower is preferred for meat. Notice that the pH meter used on this carcass registers 5.47. Microbes will grow slowly on the meat from this carcass. The pH also influences other meat characteristics like color, taste, juiciness, and tenderness. For best results, don't allow carcasses to freeze during the first 24 hours or become too warm. Here, Heikke begins to process the carcass. He starts by cutting off the front quarter. Cut through the muscle tissue just above the upper end of the shoulder blade. Run the knife on the inside of the shoulder, freeing the shoulder from the body. The shoulder is not connected to the carcass with bone, but just muscle tissue. There is a natural separation of the muscles between the shoulder and ribs. Cut between these two muscle groups to separate the shoulder from the rest of the carcass. How did it work so easily? Sharp knives are absolutely the most important part of any processing. Keep knives sharpened for clean cuts. As you can see from this angle, the muscles have a natural separation along which you can cut. Trim out the lymph nodes that lie along both sides of the neck and discard them. Open the carcass to expose the tenderloin. The tenderloin lies along the backbone in front of the pelvis, or hip. Make a cut along the spine to separate the tenderloin from the spine. Use your knife to free the top, or the head, of the tenderloin. The head of the tenderloin sits on the joint between the leg and hip. Pull lightly on the tenderloin, using your knife to separate it from the ribs. The tenderloin should readily pull from the inside of the ribs. This is a prime cut from the animal. Again, Heikke cuts along the spine, and then cuts around the head of the second tenderloin and down. He pulls out the tenderloin. With a knife, cut around the neck meat in front of the hump until you reach the bone. Now, use the meat saw to cut through the bone. The neck meat makes excellent soup or stew since the meat has more flavor and fat in the muscle. Set the neck aside for boning later. The next step is to cut off the strip loin or back strap. Using firm pressure, make a crosswise cut at the top of the hip bone, then a cut along the backbone. A second long cut is made about 1/3 of the way down the ribs. These 3 knife cuts outline a rectangular slab of meat. Cuts go here, here, and here. After these 3 cuts are made, remove the top layer of fat, if your animal has fat. Fat can be set aside for use in a gudic, or Eskimo ice cream, or combined with lean meat and sausage or burger. Using high-quality fat in recipes is important. Reindeer fat has milder flavor compared to some other types of game meat. The quality of the fat is related to diet of the animal and species. Some consumers use reindeer fat, but not moose or muskox fat. Because reindeer are free-ranging and eat natural vegetation, reindeer fat has a higher level of polyunsaturated fats and omega-3 fatty acids than beef. Nutritional comparisons are available at the end of this DVD.
Now this is the fillet. Yeah. Now I take it.
Once the fat is out of the way, we can finish removing the strip loin. Use your knife to cut along the ribs to free one side of the meat. Then, cut around the head of the strip loin, continuing down along the backbone. This will free the strip loin from the carcass. Notice the firmness of the meat and ease of handling. Properly controlling the pH results in firm meat, which is easier to cut. Let's look at it again on the other side of the carcass. A cut is made along the spine, and a second cut is made 1/3 of the way down the ribs. Again, this requires firm pressure. Remove the fat from the surface. A knife may be used to trim the fat off rather than pulling it off, as Heikke does. Cut the strip loin away from the carcass by sliding the knife along the ribs. Cut loose the head of the strip loin from the pelvis. This requires another cut along the spine to free the strip loin. This is a beautiful cut of meat and is one of the most tender on the animal. This shows what the carcass looks like with the strip loin removed. Use your meat saw to remove the rib cage from the backbone. Cut the rib cage off by following the line where you remove the strip loin. A sharp saw is important. Let's see it again from another angle. You can see how he follows the cutting line and saws through each rib. This rib section will be set aside for further processing. Now, he will remove the spine from the pelvis. Make your cut where the spine attaches to the hip. Cut between the bone. Don't try to hack through the bone. As you can see, Heikke wiggles his knife to fit between the bones to sever the connective tissue. Now he will remove the hind quarter from the pelvis. On the inside of the carcass, cut through the midline muscles connecting the two hind quarters together. Moving to the back, make a cut along the center of the spine. Run your knife along the hip bone. Here is where a long flexible knife is helpful. Cut around the pelvis on both sides. Expose the head of the hip bone and trim the meat away from the pelvis until loose. With downward pressure, continue to work, freeing the pelvis from the hind quarter. Notice the ease of trimming because the meat is hanging. In this way, gravity is your assistant by pulling the meat away from the bone as you cut. Now that the animal is in more manageable sections, let's process the meat into retail cuts. Organization of your cutting area is important. The edible trim should be on the table in a clean container. All scraps or non-edible trim will go into a box or bucket on the floor for disposal. Soon the sorting will become automatic. Garbage on the floor, trim on the table. Remove all fat from the tenderloin. Heikke is removing all fat and connective tissue as well as any blood-soaked meat. Remember to save the edible trim for burgers or sausage. The head of the tenderloin is cut off and flattened. This is comparable to the Chateaubriand steak on a beef animal. The middle section is the filet mignon.
this is the third part. Very tasty and soft meat for beefs or grill barbecue or something like that. Almost you can cut it in pieces like this. Marinade. And a little bit beer. It's okay.
Remove the meat along the hump of the animal. It has more fat and connective tissue, which shows as white in the picture. It is excellent for stew meat. Trim all fat and connective tissue. There is a long, thin sheet of connective tissue along the back of the strip loin. To remove it, cut into the loin and place your knife against this connective tissue at about a 45-degree angle. Grab the connective tissue with your hand and pull. The knife will separate the connective tissue easily from the rest of the loin. Trim the strip loin fat and connective tissue. And now we have the completed strip loin. Save the edible scraps. Meat with less connective tissue and more fat makes great stew meat. Meat that has more connective tissue should be ground. Meat from the hump has more fat and makes great stew meat. Let's process the hump meat. Trim the connective tissue from the hump. Let's watch it again, as it is cut from the other side. Remove the hump meat and separate it into sections. If you can't pull it apart as our cutter does, use a knife to cut the meat apart. Trim away the fat and connective tissue. Once again, watch as we trim the connective tissue away from the strip loin. Trim the meat from the hump away from the connective tissue. This is the hump meat, or neck meat. Cut it into chunks for stew meat. This meat provides lots of flavor.
In Russian language. What is it in English?
Stew meat.
So would this be a tender stew meat forever?
Mm-hmm. End of the ball.
Lay the rest of the strip loin out on the cutting table. Always cut the meat at a right angle to the muscle fibers.
You have to remember when you cut it, never cut it straight. You have to cut it like this.
In this piece of meat, the muscle fibers are at a 45-degree angle, so cut across the direction of the muscle fibers at a 90-degree angle. Never cut with the grain. Always cut at a 90-degree angle across the grain. The shorter the muscle fibers, the easier it is to chew. Many prime steaks come from the strip loin. Let's cut the other loin. The first loin we cut into steaks. This time, we'll keep the strip loin as a whole. In beef, this cut is known as a prime rib roast. Remember to sharpen your knife often. It will make your job easier, and you'll have less waste of meat.
Well,
Trim the fat from the neck.
Ken's on my cookie list right now. No, he borrowed my sausage thing.
Along the underside of the neck, run your knife along the spine, separating the meat from the neck bone. Run your knife along the bone. Continue to work your way around the bone, removing meat from the bone.
Told me, used my casings up, told me he was gonna bring the fat to me the next day. Still haven't seen him. Yes. He said, well, what, he said, is this my sausage stuffer? I said, nope, that's my sausage stuffer. I said, it didn't have any semblance of what you had. He did really good
You notice that the top piece of the neck was left on the bone. That was done because it is blood-soaked and has a strong, undesirable flavor. It should be discarded, not only because it doesn't taste good, but it can encourage the growth of dangerous microbes.
The dark spot.
Remove the large ligament on the top side of the neck. This is the ligament that supports the head, and it is thick and rope-like. Trim fat away from the neck and save for grinding. Cut the meat into strips and cut across the strips for stew meat. This makes excellent stew meat because of the flavor, or it can be left whole and used as a roast. Use your bone saw to cut neck bones into smaller pieces and package for soup. Let's work with the front shoulder. Trim the fat and lymph nodes from the shoulder. Discard the lymph nodes and save the fat for other processing needs. Run the knife along the leg bone. Disjoint the humerus from the shoulder. Cut away the bone completely. Run the knife along the inside of the shoulder blade. Turn the shoulder over. Run the knife along each side of the bone. There is a ridge of bone that is easy to see. Turn it over and work on the inside again. Cut along the edge of the shoulder blade and disarticulate or separate the joint and trim meat away from the shoulder bone. Trim the meat from the shoulder bone. Then cut the upper shoulder bone away from the meat. This is a completely deboned shoulder. Now we are working on the other side. Trim carefully, and remember that all meat that goes on the table is available for grinding or stew meat, and all trim that goes on the box and the floor will be discarded. Cut along the bone of the lower leg. Cut along the ridge of the bone on the back of the shoulder. Remember, you can feel it. Run the knife along each side of the upper shoulder bone, disassembling the lower leg.
Yeah, it falls apart in mine, I know. Look how the meat's on my shoulder.
Cut along the shoulder blade. Now, take out the shoulder blade, trimming additional meat for grinding or stew meat from the bone, then removing the bone from the meat. Another deboned shoulder is shown here. Remove shank meat and lower leg meat for grinding. The meat from the upper shoulder should be trimmed to fat and connective tissue but should be ground. Any meat we refer to as stew meat can be frozen or canned as you prefer. Trim fat and connective tissue. This is the major mass of the shoulder, referred to as the shoulder clod, which makes a good roast or steak. This cut has more connective tissue, but in reindeer and younger game animals, steaks are somewhat tender. You may have purchased blade steaks from the store that come from this wholesale cut of beef. On older or game animals, this cut is better for roasts. The shoulder clod can be cut into blade steaks or left whole as a roast. Blade steaks are cut first in this demonstration. These steaks have a little more connective tissue, so are tougher. Steaks should be marinated and cooked hot and fast to an internal temperature of 145 degrees. Reindeer and other game meats have a deeper red color because they contain more iron than beef. Meat from reindeer and game will remain a red color even when fully cooked. People tend to overcook because reindeer meat still looks rare. It is important to use a meat thermometer for cooking reindeer and game meat because you cannot use the same color standards as you would for beef. The biggest complaint that many people have with game meat is that it is dry. In most cases, it is dry because the meat is overcooked. If you prefer, you may cook the meat with moist cookery methods, as in Swiss steak. In this case, immerse in tomato sauce, stock, or wine and cook a long time at low temperatures. When using this method, you must use a liquid or the meat will taste dry and be less flavorful. If the cut is cooked with a dry heat method, the quick, hot heat seals the moisture inside the meat. Now the second half is left in a roast. Use moist heat techniques for preparing this cut.
You wanna leave it in a roast?
Can you make a roast? Okay.
Trim the fat from the ribs. This is a technique for making a rib roll. From the inside of the ribs, cut the meat away from each side of the rib. This is a shallow cut. Don't cut through the front side of the meat. Peel each rib back and remove the rib bone where it attaches to the brisket. This leaves the entire rib section as one slab of meat. Remove the rib meat from the brisket. Set the brisket aside and put the remainder of the rib meat section in the stew meat pile. Take the deboned section of rib meat and roll up the meat into a rib roll and tie with cotton string. Season with your favorite seasonings. Even vegetables can be rolled inside. Cook the rolled rib meat to an internal temperature of 145 degrees. It can cook in as little as an hour, but be sure to pay attention to your meat thermometer to monitor cooking times. Because it is so much fat, turn the oven temperature up at the end to crisp the surface.
And then what you use for spices in it?
Trim the fat and dried meat skin from the animal. The condition of the animal you slaughter influences the quality of the final product. A properly processed carcass with a good pH will have formed a skin or rind when exposed to the air. Disjoint the shank bone. Expose the upper leg bone by running your knife along each side. Heikke is cutting out the inside leg loin. This is one of the more tender cuts of the leg. Always trim the outside muscle from the loin. The inside loin is a heart-shaped muscle. Always trim the fat and connective tissue as you are working to avoid an inferior product.
That's a very valuable
I think so,
commercial
that's
cut.
a beautiful piece of meat.
It's called the inside,
Say it again?
inside loin.
Trim along the leg bone to separate the bone and remove it. Use your hand to find the natural separation of the muscle groups and pull them apart.
Right. Is that right?
But it's still a very valuable
Hmm.
cut. The restaurants really love that.
Yeah. Very tender, that's good to know, because on the top round on the beef, it's really, it's not as tough as the rest of the round, but good to know.
Pull out the muscle group at the outside upper leg. This cut is less tender than the rest. It has more connective tissue and should be used as a roast.
I remember this part's name.
Never figure out why. There's hairs. That's the sirloin.
Uh-huh.
It's called sirloin.
Mm-hmm.
Steaks, but they're a little bit tougher. There's a little more connective
Yeah.
tissue. I
Mm-hmm.
mean, you look at it, you think it's a really good piece of meat.
Yeah.
But off the tip, you make sirloin tip.
Yeah. It does.
Remove the rump roast. Trim fat and edges to avoid sections that cook faster than the whole. Continue to trim the fat from the meat, saving the meat for the grinder and the fat for further processing.
That's rump roast.
Here, Heikke is trimming off some scraps for later use.
But we can really do some arrows and some names to these are gonna.
I don't know, you're going to do the terminology. Beef uses a so that no one quotes
Right,
the terminology called these cuts. We like to call the deer cut.
Okay.
So it's the inside joint.
Okay.
And the one there is called the outside joint and the silver side.
Okay.
And while the rump roast.
Well, what we'll do is we'll lay it out and then we'll go back, we'll double check with y'all on
Okay, well,
the,
it's however you want to do it.
well,
Because,
you wanna do it how the industry does it,
right, well, it's,
even though we're working.
the problem is the American public knows these cuts by a certain name, and then we're
Right.
using a different name.
Ah, okay, okay.
So,
So
I
it
guess you
may
could
be,
say,
we could
in
either or.
deer, this is called this, but you may know it as.
Oh, okay, that's good to know. Yeah, that'd be a good way to do it. Well,
The remainder of the hind quarter is called the outside loin. These are the quadricep muscles of the animal. On a beef animal, this is called the bottom round steak. It can be processed as a steak or a roast. If you're making a roast, leave the connective tissue on the surface to hold in moisture while cooking. If you are making steaks, trim the connective tissue.
how many pounds of garlic in that thing?
Your bird's gonna be happy.
Yeah.
And what's this piece here?
We call it the outside loin, or it's also called the silver side loin. And
Silver side.
silver side. This is the deer and pork presentation. I don't know if this is the farm or no, but I'm not sure.
That'd be something we have to think about.
When you use at home, it's enough. You can leave.
Yeah.
But if you want to fix it very, very,
Yeah,
very,
get that fill on.
then you'll have to take this. But at the same time, you lose lots of meat because you try to take these parts away. It's very thin. You have to have a special machine.
Oh,
But it's very, very good meat, even if you haven't. Here,
So could you go put your knife on?
This is the inside loin. Use it to make steaks. It is a high quality, tender meat. This is the rump roast. It's high quality, but not easy to cut into steaks, so leave it as a roast. This is the outside loin. It's moderate quality. Cut it into steaks, but use cookery methods for less tender meats. This is the knuckle, or French woman, and can be used as steaks or roast. Use moist methods of cookery. In a beef animal, many of these cuts have different names. For example, an inside loin is referred to as a top round. A rump roast is referred to as a sirloin butt. An outside loin, or silver side loin, is referred to as a bottom round. and a knuckle, or French woman, is referred to as the sirloin tip. Now we get to the shank meat. Trim the shank meat from the bone. Since shank meat has lots of connective tissue, it should be ground or canned.
That's very important here. Here is a small bone. You have to leave this bone here.
Make sure you cut out the pin bone. This bone is sharp and can cause injury if eaten. Cut up shank meat for grinding or canning. Trim the meat from the fat. The edible trim meat can be saved for grinding or stew. Connective tissue plays an important role in how you cut and cook the product. On the right is shank meat, which has lots of connective tissue and is a tougher cut. It should be ground. The piece on the left is another piece of trim, but has less connective tissue and is a good candidate for stew meat. For people who like to use bones in cooking, Heikke is demonstrating where each bone should be cut with a bone saw. Remember, bones can be boiled, adding protein, minerals, particularly calcium, and flavor to your soups and stews.
Are you showing us there where you would make the saw cuts?
Correct.
Soft.
Yeah, I don't know if that's.
Oh, that's all right. We're both rolling.